The conversation between youth and science has impacted me personally because it's a fairly new conversation for me. It's not something that I talked about growing up in youth group, and not even as an adult youth leader. It's not something we talked about at staff meetings or even in a lot of trainings. And so this conversation has really opened up a new world of possibilities. A little scary, but it really opens things up, and I wonder if I'm not the only one that hasn't had these conversations before.
For many years, I felt like I've been alone in this conversation, finding not just uncovering that faith, science, false dichotomy, but finding common ground and living in that common ground. I oftentimes felt alone in advocating for kids and advocating for the church to be doing science and faith together.
I grew up, I think, in a culture where the two were not reconciled, and there was fear of getting too immersed in science, because if you did that, you would have to forfeit your faith. And that was sort of the culture I was raised in for many years.
I've hated science. I've never liked science. So science classes growing up throughout school, it was always a drudgery. I didn't get it. I didn't feel adequate. The only science I even remotely liked was anatomy and physiology, because there was this human element where I could see, oh, here's how my pancreas works. Here's why this all matters. So it helped me literally put flesh on science in those classes.
Well, as a youth minister, I've seen a lot of this conversation be a difficulty for youth, where they're aware of one reality in their school in a way that science approaches life and creation and the way that things work in the world, and then the church assumes this position of sometimes wanting to sort of control that. Also, these things that they learn from another source.
Looking back on my experience as a school kid, where I, was not a fan of science, I feel like I was somewhat robbed because when I hear the personal elements, when I see how it connects to my faith and my life, all of a sudden it becomes a much more compelling subject. So I feel like in many ways I was robbed of the chance to enjoy science, the chance to wonder and be in awe and explore, because I couldn't get past numbers and equations that didn't make sense to me.
So that's where I've seen it, the conflict sort of exists, but I think it exists more when we try to make faith do the work of science, where we don't let faith exist as a conversation of questions, where we try to make it answers. That's when science feels like it threatens it, because science is about asking questions, and it's not so much about getting the answers as it is about asking the questions. And so when we don't let our faith do that, they can appear to conflict.
I am a big outdoors guy, and so as I go climbing in mountains, as I go paddling, I'm captured by this sense of awe around the created world, and not seeing it just as nature, but as seeing it as somehow part of what God is doing in my life, and that this world around me is worthy of study and an encounter with.
And I'm more able now and willing to delve into science. I mean, I'm not a scientist, but I'm really intrigued. I'm fascinated by scientific discoveries, of plausible discoveries, of theories that might turn into realities. And so I'm engaged in those conversations now as a thoughtful Christian. And I don't see there being a conflict in that.
So my church was a part of an effort that went and insulated 100 houses in my town. And I so appreciate things like that meld together our understanding of loving neighbor with science, almost turning science into a story, because I understand that. I can get on board with that. And
I'm also a dad, and so I'm also quite interested in helping my kids to experience delight and wonder in the natural world, and by getting them out there and doing stuff with them.
So I found strength in the community built here, in that it's a variety of people coming together: pastors, youth directors, educators, scientists, but also parents and nature lovers and comic book lovers, and for people to have well-rounded conversations, that it's been very powerful for me.
So it's kind of interesting and exciting. It's opened up my world a bit more to even media, to journals, to things I read online where I would have just kind of skimmed past them. But now I'm looking for even spiritual truths or realities that I can find in the midst of some of these discoveries. And I'm just not afraid of the conversation anymore as I used to be.
I don't look at science as a competitor with faith. I look at it as describing a reality that God has created. And so as a complement to faith.
So the more that I have seen science in context in terms of how it affects my everyday life and seeing the kingdom of God advance, I feel like this whole world is opening up in terms of allowing me to understand my faith and live out my faith better because of what I'm hearing about science.
Yeah, so it was interesting. The book brought to light some myths that I didn't realize were myths. Certain. I grew up thinking that the church, by and large, historically was anti-science. Again, this is sort of the myth that I was led to believe. But the book does a good job of busting up those myths or debunking those myths to the point of helping you realize that there were Christians or segments of the church that were against or opposed to science, to advancement of science. But they were more of the minority. They might have been vocal, but they were more of the minority, intended to be more along the fundamentalist lines, where some of the leading Christians and the leading church leaders and leading theologians were generally men of science, and they were men of science and faith. So that was helpful for me because it disproved some of the myths that I believed, falsely believed. But the book also helped me realize that this conversation that we're having now is nothing new. I mean, this conversation has been happening historically for a long time. That you've always had people in the Christian church who are afraid of change, who are afraid of the world becoming something different than what they know. And this book has helped sort of chronicle that, and also realize that there have been faithful examples of people who were not afraid of the unknown, not afraid of what science could reveal about the universe, about the cosmos. And so I think that's been very helpful for me to learn from the history and to bring it to our contemporary context. And so, yeah, it was, I think, interesting, eye-opening, and inspiring as well.
Well, when I read Galileo Goes to Jail, I was kind of struck by some of the minutiae of these arguments and the myths. There's 25 myths about this apparent disagreement between faith and science, and to see some of the odd details that sort of emerged as popular myth that was foundless was kind of interesting. And you see these super smart people sort of bickering over details of the story, but it kind of pointed to this whole culture of myth making that we live in, where often an untruth will exist as a popular truth and goes unchecked for decades or even longer. And so I began to work my piece for this ended up being about that kind of myth and the way we associate and sometimes even intentionally create myths that we live in.
So one of the things that really stuck out for me in the book was this whole idea of myth. And I wondered what role I've played in the life of myth for other folks. And so what have I learned in my past? My grandparents are Southern folks, and so there's a bunch of myths for Southern people, from a broom sweeping your feet is bad luck to a black cat crossing your path is bad luck, don't walk under a ladder. And so that was always in my mind as I read the book. And then I thought, wow, there's some myths that we learn or that we accept in church life, in religion, and our faith, on our faith journey. So I thought, wow, I wonder what I've learned and what I've passed on to this generation. And so this book really helped me to crack that open and to see my role in the whole myth conversation.
So Galileo Goes to Jail is a whole series of little essays, and some of them are boring, but the thing that it intrigued me most about it was that the world and the narrative, the story about how science and Christianity have interacted is way more complicated than a soundbite. It's much easier to quote Einstein in one sentence. It's quite another thing to try to really grapple with what he means when he says the word God. Or it's easy to say, well, Galileo got thrown in jail, or Copernicus did this, or whatever. And it's quite another to actually go back and to see what the world was like then, how they understood the world, and how Christianity and science interacted. And so I think that the thing that I enjoyed about the book was that it made things which were reductionist and simplistic into complicated realities, and were able to give a much fuller picture of that. Because we don't live in a simple and reductionistic world. We live in a world where there are complicated intersections between faith and science, and how we tell those stories makes a big difference. So the other part about the Galileo Goes to Jail is that a lot of these myths seem to grow out of a 19th century problem with evolution, and how to make sense of a world that is emerging because of philosophers like Hegel and Kant, and then biologists like Darwin, and economists like Adam Smith or Karl Marx. So people trying to make sense of all of these things seems to have created reductionistic and simplistic answers. And we can dismiss those and get past those into a much richer place.
I think the book Galileo Goes to Jail is a great tool, one of many tools that can be used. I enjoyed the in-depth focus on the many different myths. I also really liked how it helped me better understand the complexity of those myths from a perspective I hadn't really explored before. I'm not a huge history buff. I'm more of a let's read about futuristic ideas and creativity in that sense. And so it helped me get a better grasp on those myths throughout history. It also helped me think about my audience. Sometimes I'm a teacher of teachers, and other times I'm working with preschoolers, elementary school kids, or high school kids. So it helped me to have a strong foundation about those myths, and gave me confidence to address the questions that I get from those different age groups.